Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Melia. Thank you so much, Veronica, for inviting us. So today we're going to talk about our paper that we presented or wrote last year and presented at the AI Ethics and Society conference that somehow disappeared this year. Yeah, the paper is called Ground Truth for the Factors Affecting the Creation of Medical Data Sets for Training AI.
Hi, really nice to see you all here today. So over the last year, Microsoft has announced, like no surprise, of course, like a number of artificial intelligence initiatives in healthcare, and including their partnership with the software company Epic, which many of you know that has been developing the software for electronic health records for most hospitals in the US, but also in Europe. The idea of this collaboration was to ensure that there is a quick employment and test of algorithmically driven models in practice. So Microsoft is a big tech, is a giant, and in doubling down efforts to responsibly implement AI, amid many thorny questions about the potential for mistakes and bias, we have David Yu, who is like the chief medical officer, exclaiming, "The things that we know need to be done to apply responsible AI involve testing the algorithms on very large, diverse data sets. That's going to be very challenging if you have an organization that doesn't have that data." So in the midst of the imperative to responsibly design and implement algorithmic systems, particularly in high-risk domains such as healthcare, there are many issues in play. The European AI Act is going to be implemented. It's voted in the parliament, and it's creating much more pressure into the industry that is developing these tools in the health tech market to comply with imperatives for responsible AI. Nevertheless, there is not much discussion how these data, even before they are possible to be collected, they are possible to be created. So here where our research got started.
Yes, so we start, or at least this presentation, we'd like to start with the definition of ground truth. And ground truth is the term that's commonly used in statistics and machine learning that refers to something that's correct or true in terms of a specific problem or question. So practically speaking, when evaluating performance of AI or machine learning models, we compare their predictions against what we know or what we think is true, and hence the term ground truth. So why do we think that ground truth is important? Because that's the way we describe what's true in the medical data set, and it has far-reaching consequences. And this is a great example by Lauren Ogden-Reiner and colleagues who evaluated a few very popular real-world medical imaging data sets. And so getting back to the data sets that you have mentioned, I think they actually evaluated experts, and they discovered that clinical usefulness of models trained on these data sets was highly overestimated in the lab testing. So this happened because labels used to annotate a particular data set often comprise several visually and clinically distinct conditions. For example, a label for lung cancer aggregated several clinically distinct subtypes of cancer that also looked differently on X-ray. So think solid and a sub-solid tumor. And as a result, the performance measure on some of these subcategories was way lower than for the aggregate label. And also, the applied labels were often non-exhaustive. So some conditions and artifacts that were not accounted for. And that's a very common case in many of these open data sets nowadays. So that I want to lead you through an example of what the non-exhaustiveness can lead to. So let's imagine that we want to develop a system that can screen all the patients in a hospital who have taken an X-ray for pneumothorax. And why do you want to do pneumothorax? Is because it's a life-threatening condition, and it would be super nice to know about it really fast, because sometimes there are long queues of X-rays and you need to wait days. So you start with labeling data, just like every other medical data set. You ask a domain experts to look at your data and say whether or not there is a pneumothorax. And in this example, there is none. Then you take another one, and then your radiologist will tell you, oh yeah, there is a pneumothorax here, clearly. And then you just repeat that 100,000 times. Super easy. In reality, it probably wouldn't be the radiologist actually doing it 100,000 times, but we would use some NLP algorithm to label data based on radiological reports. But then you have it, and then you test it, and then you have a model that can actually say that, oh yeah, look, there was also a pneumothorax, I detected it, the radiologist also detected it, so we are happy. We have a model that can detect pneumothorax based on X-ray. But then, let's say you are a little bit more curious person, and you want to look whether that prediction is actually true. Not many people do it, not everyone does it, that's a little bit scary. So in this situation, you would actually like to see where the pneumothorax is. So you ask your radiologist, your friend radiologist, we all have one, to mark where, according to them, the pneumothorax is located on this X-ray. And then you use one of the explainable AI methods to mark where your model thinks the pneumothorax is. And the model marks that place. So even though the label, the outcome label, was true, so you would score on all your performance metrics, the actual reason why you predicted true is wrong. So you have well, that does not inspire confidence. But like, why actually that model has marked this little thing instead of the actual pneumothorax? So that little thing, to those of you who are not medical experts, like I am not, is a chest drain. So when you have a pneumothorax, usually you are intubated. So they put a tube in your lung to treat a pneumothorax. So the system learns to detect it because it's visually more prominent feature than the pneumothorax itself, and it's often co-occurred with a treated pneumothorax. So the pneumothorax was there, but so was the chest drain that was used to treat it. And if we train our model on that kind of a data set, then we may end up with a system that's not really clinically useful. So in this hypothetical system, it would be super good for detecting the effect of pneumothorax treatment rather than screening for the undiscovered pneumothorax. And this exact problem was discovered and described in the paper by Lauren Ochtenreider and colleagues that I have just mentioned. And this suggests that there are many ways in which labels can affect a system's performance and how useful it is in practice.
So this got us really curious. And because so much depends on the label, we had some questions. Who decides in the first place what should be labeled? And then whose definitions are used for the label? What's the relationship between the data that's possible to be collected and the label itself? And what factors affect the design of the medical data sets prior to data labeling? So we had to explore this, and we went exploring it by employing ethnographic methods. So we conducted in situ ethnography in 3 health organizations in Northern and Western Europe, and we interviewed in total 26 experts working predominantly as computer scientists, designers, software engineers, medical professionals, radiologists, or in various like operational management roles. We also spent time observing their daily workflow during the creation of the medical data sets for the specific purpose for designing diagnostic algorithm systems. So let's give you a bit of a context for each health tech organization we started. Organization number 1 was a collaboration between academia, startup company, and the public healthcare sector. The aim was to develop algorithmic software for test X-rays with the aspiration to be globally used. Organization 2 was a large multinational company developing healthcare technologies and medical devices. The last year were started developing algorithmically driven diagnostic tools. Our primary engagement there was with the company section that developed like big algorithmically driven diagnostic tools and systems for oncological radiology, particularly lung and pancreatic cancer. And last organization, Break, was a mid-sized company, a startup developing algorithmically driven platform in order to automatically match-make patients with clinical trials. So what did we learn by the time that we spent with them? Traditionally, sorry.
No, yeah, I think the first thing that we learned is that traditionally, when you look at the data creation processes, they are depicted as a simple three-step process. So usually you do just data collection, you clean the data, and then you label the data, and boom, you have a data set. I mean, it's simple. That was in quotation, let's say. But what we have seen during the time that we spent with our experts is that the work that we have observed, it didn't really fit any of these three steps that were mapped in the literature, or the computer science literature. So we conceptualized an extra step that was called the design of ground truth schema, a process which is collaborative and highly situated, and where various stakeholders meet to design the schema for their ground truth. While we hear a lot in computer science about the ground truth, what we conceptualize in our research that can be described as ground truth schema can be described as a collection of metrics and relational labels, as well as their definitions and examples that are used during data labeling. So that's our schema for the truth that's going to be embedded in the data set.
So nevertheless, what we found out through the ethnography we have conducted and analyzing our data is that there are three steps that they are interdependent and they are often met in constraints. In fact, every stage of the medical data creation is dependent into the labor of diverse expertises, human expertises, and this collaborative data labor is subjected into external constraints that affect the way that the organizations and the experts address the essential trade-offs during their decision making. So during our data analysis, we identified 5 factors that affect what ends up created as medical data set. The 3 of these factors were external to what the stages that we have identified as pre-labeling activities were, and the other 2 factors were internal. So the first external factor was an existential imperative for compliance with legal and regulatory standards. And we all know that the medical domain is like a kind of highly regulated domain. So apart from GDPR, there has been a lot of regulations and laws and good practices in place to be compliant. So both the experts and the organization and entities have to comply with it during every step of the medical data creation. We found that 2 of the 3 organizations have spent contractual agreements with local hospitals, have specific contractual agreements with local hospitals in order to collect high quality X-rays. Furthermore, the collected medical data had to comply with GDPR. The experts during their workflow had to adhere to a series of professional standards such as food manufacturing or good medical practices, or even protocols and quality standards such as the ISO and the HIPAA. These constraints affected the amount of the data that was possible to be collected. Each collection came with the GDPR strings attached, which meant that, like, for the intended purpose of use, the data was possible to be collected, but any deviation from it would mean that the company would have to do from scratch all the ethics approval process. And finally, of course, this affected the amount and the type of data that reached the state of the ground truth design that Hubert just tried to establish as a concept. Senior data scientists in organization 2 was worried that they have ended up with biased data and an unfair end product, since due to GDPR, what was managed to be collected in the very first stage of the medical data creation was in fact very much restricted. Then let's think how the context of the medical dataset creation can affect the context of its use. Here is an example of another ethnographic study that happened last year, where junior radiologists in a southern public hospital were implementing for the first time an algorithmic system to diagnose lung pathology. This model was trained with datasets that startup actually managed to buy from companies in Europe. Nevertheless, there was no guarantee about the representativeness of this dataset. So what happens when a model that is trained with data collected from a specific context hits the reality and the data of the intended context used? We identified the implications of having a context, both geographical and linguistic, where the data were collected and the ground truth schema was designed, different from the context of the intended use. Furthermore, in our study, we discovered that due to the regulatory constraints, there was a constrained demographic coverage in the data that was managed to be collected by the organizations in the first place. This ended up affecting the representativeness of the dataset, which labels were selected by the experts, and in the end, the application of the designed ground truth schema when it was implemented in different contexts. This was particularly crucial when, for example, the data scientists and designers realized that the same medical terms in English-speaking countries had a differentiated meaning in other parts of the world. As usability designer and organization too mentioned, the patient demographics have differentiation. So you can have a model trained with data by population A applied to population B. Lastly, and if we try to zoom out from these nitty-gritty processes of the experts when they try to create data in the AI pipeline, we found that specific commercial and operational pressures have their fair part in affecting medical data creation. The organizations have both to consider the existing state-of-art solution and methods, and at the same time to address all the pressures by the market competition. So each organization had a different business model, and from a mid-sized startup to a multinational company to a private and public collaboration as organization one. And this has perplexed the scalability and the capacity of each organization to have access to resources and to also distribute the resources internally. These pressures ended up affecting the amount of the data that was possible to be collected and the data that actually managed to get labeled. It also affected what was possible to be designed into the ground truth schema stage and the very type of the data that reached the stage of the ground truth design. As product owner in organization 2 was trying to explain about the company's decisions of how they were able to prioritize diagnostic tool development, it's a combination of alignment with the business priorities, and that is also strongly driven by customer requests and customer demand. So that is actually very important. Try to find an alignment. So now let's move to the internal factors.
Yeah. So in the internal factors, we define the negotiations between the medical and technical domain on concrete labels. So we conceptualize them as epistemic differences and limits of labeling. So epistemic differences originated from the different priorities for created data sets. Data scientists whose values were dominating this area, they prioritize qualities like consistency, quantity, and accuracy, whereas the medical professionals, to them, the medical data set meant to capture the current state of medical knowledge and provide clinically useful data. So when designing the ground truth schema that is deciding what to label, machine learning engineers, computer scientists, and data scientists usually led that process. And they voiced what kind of qualities they needed and discussed with medical professionals and other domain experts on how to achieve it. However, because they did not have a deep understanding of the concepts that were to be labeled, sometimes they ended up with labels that were not useful in real practice. For example, trying to assess the state of patient's health based on an X-ray, no radiologist can do that. And they use way more information than just the X-ray to actually interpret how the patient is feeling. So what the radiologist ended up doing in that situation was going with their gut feeling and trying to recreate the most probable medical history for a patient when labeling that X-ray. And clearly that they were far off the ground truth that we really like to talk about, and that was later these labels were considered for. So this cluster priorities is well captured in this quote from a radiologist who was asked to label chest X-rays. However, they were not offered any additional data on patients, and that was widely different to their regular work practice, and that negatively affected the quality of the provided label. And the second internal factor was limit of labeling, and this factor was closely related to the actual labeling of data and emerged way later in the process of collaborating on the ground truth schema. So what this factor suggests is that using labels provided by domain experts who were certified radiologists, the best of the best, may be easily influenced. Framing the labeling task may result in the introduction of filler or artificial labels. Similarly, we can have experts with infinite experience, but if we label them, if they use, for instance, a super small laptop screen, they won't be able to see the same details as they would in practice with high definition diagnostic screens. And finally, since we're in Scandinavia, we don't have that many tuberculosis cases, practically none.
I'm happy with no tuberculosis.
But tuberculosis is a very prevalent condition in developing countries where such systems are often targeted for. But then when you think about it, how good will the label of tuberculosis be if it's applied by a board-certified radiologist from Denmark who maybe have seen only a handful of such cases in their entirety of career? So all these conditions, all these factors condition the quality of the label and the quality of the model that's later on trained on these labels. And we have another great quote. When evaluating the ground truth schema in organization 1, a group of external radiologists was asked to label 20 X-rays, and the data set contained a few X-rays without findings. However, when labeling, none of the radiologists actually marked any of these X-rays as normal or without label. And that was later explained by a senior radiologist who said that since the ratio of normal X-rays to X-rays with findings was different than in their practice, radiologists tasked with the labeling wanted to over-report to be on the safe side. And as a result, there were way more findings suddenly than there were in reality, or like there were way more findings labeled or reported than there were in reality. And again, that negatively affected the accuracy of the applied label.
But why all this is even important? To whom is important, and for what reason? So we argue that by identifying factors affecting the pre-labeling stage and stating the design of the ground truth schema as this step that precedes the data labeling process, we argue that data scientists, lawyers, policymakers, designers, when they are designing and also regulating for responsible medical AI, to take into account firstly that there are externally imposed constraints that affect both the data collection and the design of the ground truth schema, and actually that foundational decisions take place during the design of a ground truth schema. Under the light of the European AI Act, but also the US blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, diagnostic algorithmic systems are classified as high-risk algorithmic systems, which means extra regulation to make sure that these systems are responsibly and safely developed and employed. The Act requirements for high-quality data sets do not take into account which factors are constraining the creation of data sets for the design of high-risk AI in the first place. And what's really at stake when creating medical data is far less clear and defined than the regulation seems to imagine. So this is it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for